They threw me out after dinner. No shouting, no plates flying, just my father's voice cutting through the room like a blade. "If you can't help your sister Clara, you don't belong here." That sentence ended 39 years of loyalty in less than 10 seconds. My name is Clara Warren. I'm 39, a real estate consultant from Savannah, Georgia. And that night, I realized something I wish I had learned sooner. In my family, love wasn't unconditional. It was transactional. If you've ever been treated like your kindness was a debt you still owed, leave a single dot below. Because I know exactly how that feels. For years, I was the one keeping our house standing, literally. When Dad's hardware store went bankrupt, I paid off the mortgage to save our home from foreclosure. When Mom needed surgery, I covered every hospital bill. And when my sister Lauren dropped out of college, I helped her start fresh in the city. I never asked for credit, never asked for thanks. But that night, all those sacrifices vanished like they'd never happened. The table was set perfectly: ribs, mashed potatoes, cornbread, the smell of Mom's perfume mixing with smoke from Dad's old grill. It looked like a picture of family, but it felt like a stage play. Lauren sat beside him, laughing softly, her diamond earrings catching the light, a gift, no doubt, from someone else's generosity. Dad lifted his glass. "Your sister's been working hard lately. She just needs a little help getting to work." I knew where this was going. "Clara," he said, "you're doing well now. Maybe you could buy her a car, something simple." My fork froze mid-air. "A car?" Mom stepped in quickly, voice sweet but sharp. "It's not that much to ask, honey. You're single, no kids, and business is good. It wouldn't even make a dent." That last line hit harder than it should have, because it wasn't about money. It was about control. Lauren gave her usual soft smile, pretending reluctance. "It would really help me get on my feet." I put my fork down carefully. "I'm not buying her a car." Silence, then Dad's voice, low, disappointed. "You've become selfish, Clara. After everything we've done for you, everything they'd done for me." The words echoed until I almost laughed, but there was no humor left in me. When he pointed at the door and said, "Leave," I did. I walked out into the cool Savannah night, the scent of smoke still clinging to my hair, my heart pounding but strangely calm. They thought they'd thrown me away. What they didn't know was that I already owned the very roof over their heads. I didn't cry that night. I thought I would. But as I sat in my car outside their house, watching the porch light flicker like it always did, all I felt was empty. It was strange, realizing that the place I'd fought to save wasn't really home anymore. When I got back to my apartment, I poured myself a glass of wine and stared at the wall. The silence felt heavy, but clean, like the air after a storm. Then my phone buzzed. Lauren. For a moment, I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. "Clara!" My card just got declined. "Did you close that account?" That account. The one I'd set up years ago to help her build credit, back when she was still trying to find her footing. I hadn't looked at it in years. I thought she'd closed it long ago. "I didn't close anything," I said slowly. "What are you talking about?" She huffed. "Well, you better check because it's not working, and I need to pay my rent." The line went dead before I could reply. Something in my gut told me to check it right then. I grabbed my laptop, logged into the shared bank portal, and froze. There it was. Hundreds of transactions, designer clothes, spa appointments, a $780 dinner in Charleston, subscription after subscription, and even a payment to a realtor I didn't recognize. My name was still on the account, but she'd been using it like a personal fund. I leaned back, staring at the screen until the words blurred. It wasn't even about the money. It was about what it confirmed, that while I was paying off Mom's medical debt and saving Dad's home, Lauren had been spending my money like I didn't exist. And that's when I saw it, buried under months of charges. A mortgage payment, not for my apartment, not for their house, for an address I didn't recognize. Curiosity took over. I looked it up. It was their house. The same house they'd saved years ago, the one I'd bailed out when Dad's business failed. I scrolled further and felt my breath catch. Every mortgage payment had been automatically drawn from my secondary account, the one I'd set up to receive commissions from work. They'd never changed the billing info. For years, I had unknowingly been paying the mortgage for the home they just threw me out of. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was insane. Every cent I'd sent to save that place had made me the de facto owner. The property title was in my name, a legal transfer Dad had done in desperation when the bank refused to extend his loan. He probably thought it was temporary. He probably thought I'd never check. But I did. And that's when everything changed. The next morning, I drove to the courthouse in downtown Savannah. The clerk looked at me over her glasses as I handed her the property records. "Yes, Ms. Warren," she said after a moment. "You're the primary owner. This property's been in your name since 2018. I just stood there, numb. 5 years. 5 years they'd been living under my roof, pretending it was theirs, while calling me selfish for not buying my sister a car. I walked out into the sunlight, feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Clarity. Not revenge. Not even anger. Just peace. They threw me out of a house I owned. The irony was almost poetic. That night, Lauren called again. This time I didn't answer. Instead, I opened my laptop and stared at the mortgage documents glowing softly on the screen. My signature was right there, steady, confident, undeniable. I took a deep breath and whispered to myself, "They wanted me gone. Fine. But now they'll have to pay rent." It wasn't about getting even. It was about finally standing up for myself. For years, I'd been the one cleaning up everyone's mess, holding the weight of their chaos. But now, for the first time, the balance was in my hands, and I intended to keep it that way. 2 days after the discovery, I parked across the street from the house I'd been thrown out of. It looked peaceful, the same trimmed hedges, the same faded blue shutters. The only difference was me. This time I wasn't a guest. I was the owner. The morning air was sharp, still carrying the salt of the nearby river. I sat in my car for a long moment, watching sunlight stretch across the porch. For years, I'd poured my heart and paycheck into keeping that place alive. Now it was mine, and then somehow it still didn't feel like victory. Finally, I stepped out, heels clicking against the driveway I had paid for. The door was unlocked. It always was. I pushed it open, and the smell of coffee and fried eggs hit me, a smell that used to mean home. Mom was at the counter, humming softly to herself. When she turned and saw me, the color drained from her face. "Clara," she whispered, setting the spatula down. Her voice trembled, not from surprise, but from guilt. I could see it immediately. "I didn't come to fight," I said quietly. "I just came to ask one question." "Did you know?" She blinked. "Know what?" "That this house, the one you threw me out of, is in my name. Has been for 5 years. The silence that followed was louder than any shouting could have been." Mom looked down, pressing her palm flat against the counter. "Your father said it was temporary," she murmured. "He promised he'd fix it." "I thought he did." I exhaled, the ache in my chest deepening. "You knew, Mom. You watched me pay the mortgage every month. You knew where those payments came from." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't deny it. "You have to understand, he was scared, Clara." We were all scared. I just wanted to keep the family together. By lying to me? My voice cracked, quiet but sharp. By letting me save a house you'd rather I didn't belong in? The back door creaked, and Dad stepped in, unshaven, holding a mug. He froze when he saw me. "Well," he said slowly, "look who decided to come back." "Cut the act," I said, turning to face him. "You've been living in a house that legally belongs to me." His jaw twitched, but he didn't flinch. "That's ridiculous." I reached into my bag and laid the printed deed on the counter. His name nowhere. Mine. Bold and clear. Mom covered her mouth. Dad's face darkened. You transferred it to me back in 2018, I said evenly. You needed my credit score to save the loan. I guess you forgot I kept all the paperwork. He stepped closer, his voice rising. You think this gives you some kind of power over us? No, I said softly. It just gives me the truth. Something this house hasn't seen in a long time. Lauren came down the stairs then, hair tousled, clutching her phone. What's going on? Dad barked. Your sister's trying to take what's ours. I turned to her, calm. Funny, because I've been paying your rent too, apparently. She blinked, confused, then realized I wasn't bluffing. You went through my account? I went through the account you've been using as your personal ATM, the one I opened to help you, not to fund your weekend trips and spa days. Her face reddened, but she didn't apologize. You've always held things over us, Clara. You like being the one in control. That made me laugh, quietly, painfully. Control? You mean responsibility? The kind no one else ever wanted. Dad slammed his mug on the counter. That's enough. You can't come in here and— I can, I interrupted gently, because this is my property. You wanted me gone and I went. But now, if you want to stay, we'll have to make it official. He stared at me, disbelief hardening into fury. You wouldn't dare! Mom's voice broke in, trembling. Clara, please, you can't do this. We're your family. I met her eyes, the same soft blue as mine. That word doesn't mean what it used to, Mom. Not after the lies, not after the silence. She looked away, and for a moment, I saw something deeper than guilt. Regret. Maybe even shame. I picked up the papers and turned toward the door. You don't have to decide now, I said softly. But next week, I'll be mailing the lease agreement. You can sign it, or you can move out. Either way, I'm done being the fool who pays for everyone else's comfort. No one spoke as I walked out. The sound of my heels echoed down the hallway, each step heavier than the last, but also freer. When I reached the driveway, I paused, glancing back at the window. Mom was standing there, her hand pressed against the glass, eyes full of the same pleading warmth that once meant love. But this time, I didn't go back. As I got into my car, a strange peace settled over me. For the first time, I didn't feel like the daughter they'd thrown away. I felt like the woman who'd finally stopped begging to be seen and started standing where she belonged, on her own ground. For the next few days, the house stayed quiet. No calls, no messages. It was almost peaceful. Too peaceful. I knew my family well enough to recognize silence as a strategy, not surrender. 3 days later, I sent out the lease agreement. It was polite, formal, the way I wished every conversation in that house had been. A fair rent, below market value, with 60 days to decide. I thought maybe, just maybe, they'd take it with grace. But that hope didn't last long. It started with a voicemail from Mom. Her voice was soft, cautious, the way she spoke when trying to hide something. Clara, honey, I think we need to talk. There's been a misunderstanding. Your father's meeting with someone at the bank tomorrow, and The message cut off there. My stomach sank. The bank. By the time I drove to the branch the next morning, I already knew what I'd find. And sure enough, there they were. Dad, Mom, and Lauren, sitting across from a loan officer in a glass-walled office, the same way they had 5 years ago. I didn't walk in right away. I just stood there behind the glass watching them talk, seeing the familiar pattern play out. Dad leaned forward, gesturing with his hands, his tone firm but desperate. Lauren was nodding beside him, trying to look serious. And Mom? She looked down, avoiding eye contact, clutching her purse like a lifeline. I didn't need to hear the words. They were trying to refinance the house, my house, behind my back. Something inside me went quiet. Not angry, just cold. After everything, after I gave them a choice, they still chose deceit. When I stepped into the office, the air shifted instantly. The loan officer looked relieved, as if he'd been waiting for me. "Ms. Warren?" he said quickly. "We were just discussing the ownership documents." Dad turned sharply, his expression hardening. "You had no right to come here." "Oh, I think I do," I said calmly. "Especially since my name's the only one on that deed." Lauren stood up, voice sharp. "You're ruining everything." "We were just trying to fix this mess." "By pretending it's yours?" I asked. Her lips trembled. She didn't answer. Mom's eyes were wet now. "Clara, please," she whispered. "We didn't mean to. Your father thought if he could refinance—" I cut her off softly. "You mean he thought if he could trick the bank into removing my name, he could take back what I paid for?" Dad slammed his palm on the table. "We built that house. You wouldn't have had anything if it weren't for us." I met his glare steadily. "You're right. I wouldn't have had the chance to learn what ownership means, not until you tried to take it from me." The loan officer cleared his throat awkwardly. "Mr. Warren, unless your daughter signs, this application isn't valid." Dad's face turned a deep red. Mom wiped at her eyes. Lauren muttered something about me being heartless, and for the first time in my life, I didn't flinch. I walked out of the bank with the sunlight on my face, the papers in my bag, and a strange stillness in my chest. That was the moment I understood. They didn't want me. They wanted control, and losing that control scared them more than losing me. That night, I poured myself another glass of wine and sat on the balcony, the Savannah sky glowing pink and gold above the rooftops. I thought about calling Mom. I almost did. But when I pictured her face at the bank, the way she looked at me, not with love but with pleading, I stopped. Instead, I called my lawyer. He listened quietly as I explained everything. When I finished, he sighed. "You've given them every chance to do right by you. File the notice. It's time to make it official." The next morning, I sent the eviction letter. It wasn't revenge, it was clarity, a final line between what was mine and what wasn't. 2 days later, I got a text from Lauren. "How can you do this to us? You're destroying the family?" I stared at the message for a long time before typing back, "You destroyed it the night you all agreed I didn't belong." Then I hit send. Later that evening, my phone buzzed again. This time, Mom. Her message was short. "I didn't want it to go this way." "But your father, he's selling things. Please don't come tomorrow." I read it twice, then set my phone down. For years, I'd been the one holding the pieces together. Now I finally understood what it meant to let them fall. The next day, I drove by the house one last time. The curtains were drawn, the yard overgrown. The porch light was off. It looked nothing like the home I once saved, and everything like the truth I'd been avoiding. Family isn't the people who live under your roof. It's the ones who don't try to burn it down when you finally stand on your own. And as I drove away, I felt it. The ache, the loss, and the strange freedom that comes after betrayal. The kind that doesn't harden you, just teaches you who you really are. The day the eviction notice became official, I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt tired. Tired in a way that comes from years of giving without being seen. But there was something else under that exhaustion, a quiet certainty that this time I had done the right thing. My lawyer called that morning. "They haven't responded to the notice," he said. "I figured," I replied. "They never do until they have no choice." He paused, his tone softer. "Clara, you don't have to explain yourself. You've shown more grace than most would." I thanked him and hung up, my hand trembling slightly around the phone. That afternoon, I stopped by the courthouse again to file the final papers. The clerk, the same woman from before, smiled faintly when she recognized me. "You're almost done," she said. "Once the notice expires, the property's fully under your control." Fully under my control. It sounded strange. For so long, that house had been the center of my guilt. Now it was simply a line of ink on a deed. When I stepped outside, the sky over Savannah was turning silver, clouds rolling in from the coast. It was going to rain, and somehow that felt fitting. I drove by the house one last time, the wipers brushing away the drizzle. The "for sale" sign I'd ordered stood planted in the front yard, slightly tilted in the wind. The curtains were gone, so were the cars. They'd moved out quietly, without a word. I parked across the street and sat there, listening to the rain on the windshield. I thought I'd feel empty, or maybe guilty. But instead, I felt something new. Peace. Not the fragile kind that depends on keeping everyone happy, but the steady kind that comes from finally choosing yourself. As the rain softened, I stepped out and walked up to the porch. The wooden boards creaked under my feet, just like they used to. I reached for the doorknob and hesitated. For a second, I could almost hear their voices again. Dad's booming laughter, Mom's soft humming, Lauren's sharp giggle, echoes of a family that never really saw me. I took a deep breath and turned the knob. The door opened with a sigh and I stepped inside. Empty walls, quiet rooms, and sunlight, faint but warm, breaking through the clouds and pouring across the floorboards. That light hit the spot where our old dining table used to be, the same place where Dad had told me I didn't belong. Now the only thing left there was dust and a beam of golden light, and somehow that was enough. I smiled, not from pride, but from release. The house no longer carried their power. It was just space, and space, I realized, was all I ever needed to start over. When I walked out and locked the door behind me, the key felt lighter in my hand than it ever had before. I drove toward the coast, rolling the windows down to let the rain-salted wind in. Savannah faded behind me, but the weight that had anchored me there didn't follow. Sometimes justice doesn't look like revenge. It looks like peace, like a woman finally closing a door that should have been shut years ago. And as the road opened ahead, I whispered softly, not in anger, but in gratitude, "Thank you for throwing me out," because it led me back to myself. It's been half a year since I left Savannah behind. 6 quiet months of rediscovering what it means to wake up without dread, to go to sleep without guilt. There are still nights when I hear echoes of the past. My father's voice, sharp as splinters, my mother's hush, desperate to keep the peace, Lauren's laughter, light and careless. But they fade faster now, like waves that used to crash but have learned to break softly. I live in Charleston now, in a small white cottage tucked near the marshlands. It's not big, not luxurious, but every inch of it feels like breath. I painted the walls myself. The curtains are pale blue, the same shade as the sky right before sunrise. And every morning, when the first light slips through them, I remind myself, this is peace you built, not peace you begged for. Some mornings, I make coffee and sit on the porch, listening to the soft hum of the world waking up. The marsh smells of salt and wildflowers. The air feels clean, untouched by old arguments or expectations. It's strange. After years of trying to keep everyone happy, silence now feels like a blessing. One afternoon, while sorting through old boxes, I found something I hadn't seen in years. A photo of us. Me, Lauren, and Mom, standing in front of the house the day I paid off the last of Dad's debt. We were smiling, but looking at it now I could see it. The exhaustion in my eyes, the relief in theirs. It wasn't a family photo. It was a transaction frozen in time. That night, as I sat by the window with a cup of tea, I caught myself whispering, "You did your best." And for the first time, I actually believed it. Forgiveness didn't mean they were right. It just meant I was done carrying what wasn't mine to hold. A week later, a letter arrived. No return address. But I knew the handwriting, Mom's. It said simply, "I hope you're doing well, Clara. We talk about you sometimes. Your father misses you more than he'll admit." I read it twice, folded it neatly, and placed it in my desk drawer, not out of anger, but because I wasn't ready to throw it away. Some things deserve to rest quietly, without reopening the wound. Now I spend my evenings walking down to the pier behind my cottage. The sun sinks into the water like a slow exhale, and the waves carry a rhythm that feels almost like forgiveness. I breathe with it, not for them, but for me. People still ask if I regret evicting my own family. I smile softly. No, I tell them. I didn't throw them out. I just stopped letting them live rent-free in my head. The past no longer owns me, and that's a kind of freedom money could never buy. So if you've ever been made to feel guilty for protecting your peace, if you've ever had to close a door that love refused to keep open, know this: you are not cruel for choosing yourself. You're just finally learning how to breathe again. And if stories like this remind you that you're not alone in that choice, take a moment to subscribe. Not for me, but for yourself. So you'll never miss a story that reminds you how strong it is to walk away quietly and still wish them peace.